Okay, so I will just introduce myself. I'm Mary Eliza. I'm the Land Use and Transportation Chair for the Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods. And we've been conducting town halls for a while because we can't go anywhere. And it just seems like a really good format to use. It's been working so far. We just have one subject each meeting. And any other business can be taken care of offline or by email during other times. So I've taken Eileen's suggestion to cover the housing element 2022. Hi, Al, at today's meeting. And we've asked a couple of people to handle the meeting for us. So Stuart Flashman is going to moderate. I'm sorry, my voice is not very good. I have like allergies, so that's why I asked other people to do this. Stuart Flashman is going to moderate, and Shelley, and I'm not going to try and pronounce her last name, from the planning department is going to tell us about the housing element. I'm going to give this back to Stuart to start.
Okay, let me just say a couple of words about myself. I'm an attorney located in Oakland, and I do I deal a lot with general plans, and I guess that's why they asked me to moderate the questions here. But I will basically just be looking for people to either put up their hand, and you can do that. Let's see, it depends somewhat on what vehicle you're using, how. I think it's under reactions. Yeah, if you click on the reaction, one of the things there is raise your hand. So I will be looking for people to either virtually raise a hand, or if you want to actually raise your hand, you can do that too. And they'll also, you could also, if you want to, put your questions in chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat. So with that, I will turn the meeting over to Shelley to start her presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Shelley Caltagirone, if you want to use my last name, but I just go by Shelley. I'm working with the planning department. Been there for about 14 years now. And I've recently joined the housing element update team to help support with outreach specifically. My professional focus is actually in cultural heritage planning, and I worked for more than a decade in our current planning division, processing permits and doing SEQA review and staying more on the regulatory side of the planning department. So full disclosure, I am not a housing policy expert. I'm here in my capacity as an outreach facilitator, but for that reason, our project lead, Kimia Hadadan, is going to be joining us about halfway through. She's currently attending another engagement event. So Kimia will join us around 6 o'clock, and she'll be here hopefully for most of the discussion to answer any hardball questions. I just wanted to get a sense of how many folks are familiar with the housing element, the current draft that was published in April. If you want to practice virtual or real raising your hand, if you've had a chance to read parts of it. Okay. All right. That just helps me understand how fast or slow to go. My presentation is about 20 minutes long. I'll try not to talk too much because I want to hear your feedback. And I will just want to make one note about logistics. I have a 4-year-old that's been out of the house all day, and he's just woken up from a nap. So he may be interrupting me at times, and I'll try to talk over him. So I apologize in advance if he's going to interrupt. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen now and just get that set up so I can see my notes. And here we go. And all right, now I can see some of you and my notes at the same time. So I'm going to dive in. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. The San Francisco Planning Department acknowledges that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland, and we wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush Ohlone community, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. So I just started the presentation just with some basic nuts and bolts. The housing element is the city's housing plan. It's prepared by the planning department in coordination with multiple city agencies, and it's updated every 8 years on the same cycle as all the other California cities. The housing element policies meet state law mandates so that as a city, we can maintain our eligibility for affordable housing funds. We are also required to plan for a certain number of units for different ranges of household incomes, and that's allocated, those targets are allocated to us by state and regional agencies every 8 years. A role we want to elevate for the housing element is that it is a roadmap that shows our values. It clearly defines the city's priorities, and it guides decision makers in their decisions. This housing element could be just one more plan with limited impact on our communities. Not all housing element updates are substantial. This one is, it's a major shift, and maybe one of the largest shifts we've seen in decades in housing and local housing policy. We are committed to a plan that brings critical changes to housing our American Indian, our Black, and other communities of color, as well as our low-income communities. And we think that we can accomplish that by centering the policies and actions on racial equity to directly address disparities in housing access. We can create a comprehensive roadmap that connects various resources, policies, and implementation actions across the city under one equity framework. Our housing plan should clearly inform and guide resource allocation in the city's budget with priorities for communities and programs. We can enhance the housing element accountability by elevating the implementing actions of those policies. Throughout our engagement process, we're trying to ensure that these actions are clear, they're measurable, and once adopted, this element can set a new path to hold the city accountable over the next 8 years to deliver equitable policies. And last, we want to elevate the voices of our low-income communities, our communities of color, and other vulnerable groups within the city to truly anchor this plan in racial and social equity. These groups and communities have been the pillars of our outreach and engagement for this process. And based on the input we're receiving from community leaders, the next phase of outreach is going to focus on community-led engagement through funded partnerships. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So in today's presentation, I'm going to start with a brief overview of San Francisco's housing challenge. Then I'll talk about our vision and requirements for the update. Then I'm going to spend the majority of time talking about our key policy shifts in the current draft. And then I'll end on our community engagement approach. And then we'll just open it up for discussion. So starting with housing challenges, we want to acknowledge that San Francisco's housing problem is a racial and social equity problem with severe disparate outcomes for American Indian, Black, and other communities of color. And my next couple of slides are going to illustrate exactly how severe those inequities are. These disparate outcomes are rooted in a long history of institutional racism and discriminatory programs. The timeline on the screen illustrates programs that the city either led or supported, thus contributing to the disparate life outcomes that American Indian, Black, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Latinx, other communities of color experience today. And the numbers clearly show that these disparities and of these policies and programs caused. The median income for Black households is less than 1/4 of white households in San Francisco. Compared to their share of the population, Black individuals are 7 times more likely to be unhoused, and American Indian individuals are 17 times more likely to be unhoused in San Francisco. These are all San Francisco specific data points. Data also shows that from 1990 to 2018, San Francisco's American Indian and Black populations dropped significantly by 52% and 45% respectively. And that Black, Latinx, and American Indian households are more likely to be rent burned than white households, which means that these are households that spend more than 30% of their income on rent. San Francisco's housing problem is also an economic problem, one that a strong jobs economy did not attend to. Housing production did not keep up with the increase in housing demand from new workers, as this data from 2010 to 2019 shows. Increased demand for housing combined with low housing production significantly increased the price to own a home in San Francisco. And you can see the value of all San Francisco homes in blue towards the top of the chart. And you can see the value of all California homes in green, and then at national value in gray at the bottom. From 1990 to 2018, San Francisco's higher income population rose by 262%, replacing low and moderate income households. And these economic pressures have contributed to displacement, gentrification, and exclusion in San Francisco. On this map, the deeper cool-toned colors represent areas of displacement and gentrification, and the deeper warm-toned colors represent areas of exclusion, meaning that primarily only wealthy households can afford to reside there. San Francisco has been working to change policies and find new resources to address the symptoms of these racial inequities and these racial disparities. We doubled the annual average of new housing units built in the last 5 years compared to prior decades. 4 times more affordable housing investment last year than the average of the previous 15 years. We expanded funding sources, including a housing bond, a gross receipts tax, and a real estate transfer tax to fund affordable housing and supportive housing for unhoused residents. We strengthen eviction and tenant protections, among other things. So, but we understand that dismantling housing inequalities requires a deeper long-term investment and structural changes that go beyond just addressing the symptoms of those inequities. So we've identified and articulated here 3 root causes that we are trying to address with the plan. The first being that we have accepted racial and economic inequities and segregation. We have not directly tried to address them previously. We have prioritized housing as a commodity rather than as a human right, and that we have underbuilt housing compared to increased demand. I'm going to move on to a little bit about our vision, our process, and requirements for the housing element. We have not acknowledged housing as a racial equity issue in past housing elements. This will be the first time that the San Francisco's housing plan will be centered in racial and social equity and respond to the current crisis in our country, and responding to the Planning Commission's resolution last summer centering racial equity in our work. This is also the first housing plan that will respond to significantly higher numbers of housing targets. The state modified the way that they estimate housing need, and San Francisco's share will nearly triple as a result to 82,000 units over the next 8 years by 2030. And that increase is occurring at all income levels, which I'll show towards the end of this presentation. There are a few other ways that the next update is different due to changes in state law. State law now requires us to affirmatively further fair housing. That means identifying policies and implementing programs that address racial segregation, that promote integrated living patterns. We're also required to address environmental justice issues, to address the unique or compounded health risks that especially our communities of color have endured for decades. This is a quick overview of the project's 2-year timeline. The update is due by the end of next year, end of 2022. We recently, in April, launched the second phase of outreach, which we will be closing towards the end of August. We are vetting through this process the draft policies that we published in April. This allows us to complete the environmental impact analysis over the next year. It is critical that we meet our state deadline for this process to not lose our affordable housing funds and to avoid fines of up to $100,000 per month. So I'm going to dive into the policy shifts right now. As we center the plan in racial equity, the policy shifts to focus on the needs of American Indian, Black, and other communities of color, and other vulnerable groups, including seniors, people with disabilities, extremely and very low income households, including unhoused people. It also is shifting to provide more focus for moderate and middle income households, and recognizing that 75% of that income bracket are people of color, and therefore it is a significant way to address racial and social disparities. With that context, I want to talk about 4 major policy shifts. The first is recognizing a right to housing that ensures that our extremely low and very low income households, our unhoused population, and our most vulnerable have access to housing. The second policy shift is to bring back those displaced from the city due to discriminatory programs, including actions of the redevelopment agency in the middle of last century. In those parts of the city that hold the highest percentage of vulnerable populations, which we refer to on this map as priority geographies, we aim to expand and target resources for home ownership, affordable housing preservation, tenant protection, as well as improvements to community facilities and amenities. We also want to limit zoning changes and prioritize deeply affordable housing production in these parts of the city. Lastly, in those parts of the city that best support positive economic, educational, and health outcomes for low-income families, which we refer to here as high opportunity areas, the draft policies recommend increasing investment in affordable housing and bringing more housing targeting moderate and middle income housing. So we'll dive a little more deeply into each of these and talk about some of the actions that would support these policy shifts.
Looks at all of our portfolios.
I'm hearing feedback from somebody. It's gone. Okay. So first, the housing element update that we're proposing would be the first policy document in San Francisco to potentially recognize the right to housing, ensuring that everyone, regardless of income level, has access to housing. This means creating a minimum number of supportive housing units and services, expanding rental assistance programs to match the need, and prioritizing residents of those priority geographies and accessing supportive housing or shelter. And the second shift would seek to bring back those displaced from the city due to discriminatory programs such as redevelopment, removal. In the first phase of outreach and engagement, the community members that we heard from expressed that the city should strengthen cultural anchors for displaced communities as a way of rebuilding that cultural cohesion, social cohesion that allows folks to come back, gives them a sense of home when they come back, to invest in home ownership opportunities, and to dedicate land to American Indian communities. Next, major policy shifts for priority geographies mean more housing that is deeply affordable in these areas, exploring ways that low-income communities of color can receive priority to that deeply affordable housing. On the other hand, we want to look at limiting zoning changes in these areas to the needs of American Indian, Black, and other communities of color. This is one way to bring stability to the areas that have seen the most rapid pace of change in the last couple of decades. And then last, we recognize housing production has been heavily concentrated in the priority geographies on the east side of the city. We also recognize that less than 12% of our affordable housing units are located in high opportunity areas. As shown on this map, many neighborhoods within these areas have remained mostly clear of affordable housing. We want to distribute housing throughout the city. We want to lower the constant burden of change and pressure on low-income communities of color due to concentrating new housing in their neighborhoods. And we want to provide housing options for low-income communities of color in neighborhoods that have high-quality amenities and wealth-building opportunities. We feel we can accomplish this by increasing development capacity along transit corridors and through low-density residential districts. We want to establish a goal of building 50% of our regional housing targets in these areas, in primarily small and mid-rise buildings. And we want to ensure privately built housing can serve moderate and middle income households. Lastly, the new housing should serve all income levels. This is a breakdown of our targets by income. The yellow shows the upcoming targets. Very low to moderate income households are served by publicly funded housing, as well as by private market through below market rate requirements. However, to serve middle income households, we rely on the private market only. And the draft plan is trying to find ways that the private market can serve middle income households. Again, we recognize that it's failed to do so in the last few decades. I'm going to spend just another 3 minutes talking about our engagement process, and then I want to open up for a discussion. So phase 1 of outreach started in June of 2020. We held 15 listening sessions. We administered a survey with over 1,600 respondents, most of which were low-income people of color. And many of those surveys were administered in person with the help of our resident ambassadors. We worked with a group of housing policy and development experts, along with a core and a broader interagency review team to create the first draft of goals, policies, and actions that were published in April. This is a list of our listening sessions. We attended existing trusted community meetings like this one. And in that way, we were able to reach residents that were most impacted by housing inequities, as well as reach a variety of different geographies. This is a list of the organizations who participated in our housing policy group meetings. There were a total of 8 meetings in that first phase of engagement, and we grouped this list based on the number of meetings that each one attended. You can see there were 49 organizations total. So in the second phase, which we started in April, we're reviewing the first draft and the key policy changes through a variety of groups and approaches. Our main approach is working by partnering with community organizations to design and lead focus groups. Those are groups of about 8 to 10 people. We're planning to do somewhere between 20 and 25 focus groups by the end of August. This is the primary form of engagement, but we are also working to join other community conversations that are existing, like the one tonight, where we just have asked to be invited into neighborhood conversations. We're also working with the newly created Equity Advisory Council, which it was formed to advise the Planning Department and the Planning Commission on equity concerns. In addition, and all of this, as you can, if you can read this map, all of these separate methods of engagement have the target of providing enough input so we can create a new revision that we would be publishing in November of this year, and for a second round of review by the public. So that's all I have in terms of slides. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I know you were kind enough to provide me with some questions ahead of time, and I can answer some of those that I received, or we can take questions from the audience, whatever you feel is more effective right now. Would you like me to start with some of the questions that were emailed?
Why don't you start with some of the ones that were pre-submitted, and
Okay.
let's spend a few minutes on those before we get into the audience questions.
Okay, and I'm just going to start rattling them off, but feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, or send a note in the chat. So one of the questions was about priority development areas. Our regional agencies have significantly expanded the priority development areas for San Francisco. They cover a large portion of the city. And the question was, how does the housing element factor this in? So the new priority development areas are the same corridors that the housing element is listing as corridors to focus on to increase height and increase development capacity. So in some cases, that means increasing density as well. And the environmental impact report is going to be evaluating the impacts of that potential added capacity. Any follow-up questions on that, or I can move on to the next, which is somewhat similar. It's related to transit-oriented development.
I see Linda Chapman's hand up. Linda, do you want to say something?
Yeah, if you're finished with the written questions.
I think
I have a
there's
few
a couple
more, I just wanted to see if there were any more questions or follow-up questions on the priority development areas, but I'd have 3 more questions that were emailed prior. Do you want me to finish those first? Okay.
Okay, why don't you keep
All right. So the next question was, how does the housing element address issues related to transit-oriented development and more specific transportation issues, for example, neighborhood ways? So the housing element policies highlight the connection between transportation and land use planning. Goal 6 in the draft talks about supporting transit improvements by increased ridership, as well as ensuring improvements occur in parallel to planning for new housing. The draft policies rely on San Francisco as a transit-first city, and they consider building housing near transit. It also considers other sustainable modes of transportation, including pedestrian and bicycle improvements. The next question was about a rather in-depth question about solar panels, and primarily about how solar panels are protected when they are on private buildings. So that the solar panels are rather indirectly referenced in the housing element currently in the current draft. There is a specific action meant to support environmental policies generally that would push us to streamline the permitting process for energy retrofits, which would include solar panels. But in terms of protection of solar panels, in the research I did, I found that the Department of the Environment, San Francisco Department of the Environment, developed a protecting solar access document a couple of years ago. It did not get political support at the time. And there was a supervisor that was intending to bring it forward as legislation or acting on it with legislation, but that apparently that attempt failed. Currently, the planning code does not include any protection for solar panels, which some of you might be aware. This was also recently challenged through a CEQA appeal, which was not successful. I did reach out to our current planning director this week to just ask where permit review might be headed in terms of solar panels. She's looking into into recent case law, and she'll be reporting back to me. But and she continues to monitor this because it is a resident concern that we hear quite a bit. But for now, there is nothing in the planning code. I see Mary's.
Yes, I have two questions. What are the names of the people? Which supervisor was doing that?
I couldn't find that in the documentation that we had. I was relying on some of the notes that were prepared for the recent CEQA appeal. I can look a little more deeply and get back to you after the meeting.
Okay.
And I can refer you also to the staff person at the Department of the Environment who had provided some information for the appeal. I believe he was involved in the development of that document.
Okay, we could talk about this later unless anybody else has similar questions and wants to know the answers right now. I do want to know the details of the CEQA appeal, and I do want to know who we can deal with directly.
Yeah, I could follow up both with the planner's contact information, who was the lead on the CEQA appeal, and I could get you the Board of Supervisors, the case number for it, so you could track it on their website as well, and see the reports prepared. And I believe the planner's report, I don't know if the planner's report cites the contact at the Department of the Environment, but I have that person's name that I can include for you.
Okay, I did mention that some communities have added elements into their design review, and we could also get very specific about how that's done as one way to deal with the protections once they're installed, because we have an awful lot of people who are investing money, and we have an awful lot of interest in getting off the grid and getting out of fossil fuels. So it seems like this is something we really need to deal with. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say lastly that our lead planner has been working on the city's climate action plan. Was out of the office this week. She would be a really good resource on this question. But unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to speak with her, so I can include her contact information as well.
What is her name?
Lisa Fisher.
Lisa Fisher.
That's right. Yeah. There was one last question, which was also rather technical, but we can skip that for now, or we can open up for conversation, Stuart.
I don't want some questions from the audience, the live questions. So Linda has had her hand up a long time. Linda. And then I think the other people I've seen having their hand up was Bernie and Al.
I don't
So
feel
Linda,
like
you want to go ahead? You got to get the mute off to be able to talk.
Oh,
Linda, you're still muted. It looks. Can you mute yourself? There's some background noise coming out from your.
Are you calling on me? I don't want to interrupt somebody else.
Yes.
I might figure out what's
Yes.
happening here. Okay. Well, I have so many things that I would like to say or discuss, bring up, but I don't want to take up too much time here. So a couple of things is one, the briefing slides that you just showed, I got to see earlier when CSFN sent them. And although they're very beautiful and artistic and clear in some respects, like let's say the income things, it's difficult to understand things. I'm looking at my neighborhood, Nob Hill. I can't tell anything about it because the maps don't show streets, and the way that the colors are depicted where, it's artistic. But if you had complete contrast between one place and another, with regard to, let's say low income is teal and the other is, yellow or something like that, that would be easier. Also, it doesn't explain acronyms. That should be on the bottom of the page. What's a CBO, for example? Not that you need answered. Okay, my biggest concern is you're not going to be getting very much community input, perhaps. I realize you have a difficult circumstance that you're trying, and I'm supposed to be involved in a focus group, you know, through SDA. And I know SDA somehow was involved with it that I missed, but I really care a lot about this. In the 80s, I worked on, you know, the comments for the housing element, and I even have a certificate about how my persistent organizing got housing preservation restored to the master plan as a priority policy, the housing element, when it had been dropped. You know, I really know what individual input can do. And if you have EIR comments, for example, there's a print copy you can get, you know, you can work up comments on it, send in and so on. So I don't really know, apart from the fact that I got selected for this focus group, how a person gets to participate. I realize, and I'm not blaming you, I'm just saying that you're going to have a very small slice of comments. And maybe, you know, like from experience, not that I'm the brightest kid in the room, but from experience, I know certain things that are probably not going to be in there. So I would like to suggest don't close the public comment too quickly. Make it somehow possible for people to have like an open, you know, session where they're not part of one particular group, even if it's SDA or whatever. All right, and then I have particular things, but I don't want to spend time, you know, that other people may want.
Well, thanks for asking the question about our engagement methods. And I do want to recognize that the pandemic changed the way that we do engagement. It has meant that we're doing probably about 90% of our engagement online. And we also recognize the burden that puts on folks that don't have equal access to internet or you know, digital methods like this. So, but we have been successful in organizing 25 focus groups for this phase. That's in addition to what we did in phase one. So that means we'll be talking to about 250 residents. And we prioritize talking to low-income residents, residents that represented at the vulnerable groups like seniors, people with disabilities. And I'm really happy to hear that you'll be participating in the SDA focus group this week. I'll actually be helping out with that. So that's the most intense way that we are holding conversations. Those are hour-and-a-half long conversations where we're doing deep dives on 3 to 4 questions usually. We are also holding these community conversations like tonight. We have about 20 scheduled. We're doing this intense phase right now because we want to have a bulk of input that we can feed into the draft that we need to produce in November. But that doesn't mean that the comment on the housing element is closed. We'll continue to accept comment through our website, and I'll make sure that we put our website in the chat before I go. But we accept comments and feedback anytime by contacting the project team or by submitting it through the website. And there will be public hearings starting next year as we start reviewing the EIR and the analysis within that. But thank you, Linda, and feel free to follow up with me. I'll put my email in the chat too. If you want to provide your specific comments on different policies, we'd love to receive those.
A couple of things. One is there are some background noise coming through. I would ask anyone who is not actually talking, would you please mute yourself? I don't have the ability to mute people. Maybe Mari, maybe you can mute people. There we go. Because I think that it's distracting to have the background noise coming through. One of the things just following up on that question was, does the department do anything in terms of putting up or in some sort of place the questions and answers that come out of all of these groups so that people who aren't in those groups can still get the benefit of what's happened in those groups?
Yeah, thanks for asking. We did provide a public input summary for phase one. I believe is about 60 to 70 page report. It includes both our methods and explanation of our methods in our outreach, but also deep analysis of what we heard and the themes that came out of that. It includes direct quotes from from
And
folks
is
we
that going
talked
to
to.
be accessible on the internet? To people can
Yeah,
either
the phase one
easily find
report
and-
is accessible now,
Yeah,
and we'll
it-
do the same for the second phase, and that will be available. We should have it completed around October. We'll have that analysis done so that we're using that analysis to inform the revisions.
Okay,
So that
Um,
while I can't provide you with all our meeting notes today, I mean, that'll all be summarized in that report.
okay. Bernie, you had your hand up for quite a while.
Thank you, and I commend you for the good information and the new priorities that affect the housing element raises. I would like to be short. Stuart, Flashman, I, and Lois have the expertise and experience. Quite a bit of it. I have been a planning director for very large entities. I have been very experienced in creating affordable housing. But the fact is, about 80% of our citizens cannot afford market rate. That's 600,000 people, 300,000 housing units. That's the focus. The county has never, in effect, legally measured up to a process, a means, or the resources that the law requires. The housing element you are citing was effectively abolished several years ago with the support of our representatives in the legislature, the legislature itself, and the governor. It doesn't exist. The question that we need to face is remandating an effective housing element with the state behind it and go to court. Because we still remain in the United States, perhaps the most disadvantaged, poorest housing situation ever. We are higher priced. Everything that has been proposed by our mayor, Kearns, raises the cost of housing. We have to lower the cost of housing. One of the means I strongly favor and have used is using LAFCO, the local agency finance corporation that the county endeavors that can underscore or underwrite cost and processes in a public-private endeavor. That works. We have never tried it. We have been under court injunction several times. Unfortunately, our courts are elected employees. So we have to overcome that. I think, Stuart, you have been heavily involved and you are probably very familiar with all of this. But unless you are going to change the law that needs to be done and the means to make it happen, you are going to be under, in effect, legal injunction forever. We have done this, and I can name the lawyers if you like, and they're lined up and waiting for you. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Al, you
Sure.
had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, so there was a good slide about income inequality. And so what I'm wondering, dealing with the root cause of the problem is, structural racism, and people of color don't make as much money as white people. And so I'm just wondering, what are we doing about that? I mean, it seems like building a lot of housing is okay, but it seems like a Band-Aid that doesn't really solve the underlying root cause of the problem.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and it's one that we're hearing in other conversations as well. The housing element has its limits, and it's not necessarily a tool that can directly address issues of wealth building in communities of color and communities that have been suffered the harms of racial discrimination. And while we can set a framework for actions that bring equity into housing programs, housing funding, it is not a direct answer to the issue, the underlying issue of how our residents can build wealth. We can encourage support for those folks to receive adequate and safe housing. recognizing that that is a key pillar in stabilizing someone's lives. But it is not, it's not the only answer.
But when we sell land out from underneath City College, didn't that just make the problem worse? I mean, education is how people pull themselves out of it. And, you know, if you, instead of building more, you know, educational facilities, we're building, you know, expensive condos. And I just kind of wonder, you know, what are the priorities we're doing that kind of action?
I don't think I have a response to that, but I appreciate the comment. I don't know, Kimmy, if you want to weigh in.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Sorry I joined late. I kind of want to address your comment about wealth building. I think what the housing element is trying to do, and you know, what it can do is kind of address the issues around the need for housing, and that's kind of, as Shelley said, that's a pillar of wealth building. So having stable housing, having housing that people are not cost burdened and paying, you know, 50, 60% of their income on housing is definitely a foundation for building wealth. And that comes with hand in hand with opportunities for job and education. So the housing element is taking the piece of housing, but we definitely are hearing and in conversations with agencies that work on education and jobs.
Yeah, I want to follow up on Al's question in terms of what happened with City College in terms of that big project that was put in there. And of course, you know, by comparison with a lot of other projects, that it sounds very good. It's 50% affordable, but it's also 50% market rate. And when you look at the demand, it seems like the demand is far outstripping the supply on the affordable side, but the supply is outstripping the demand on the market rate side, and yet we're still building 50% of the project is market rate. How do you get around that? It seems like as long as you're depending on the private sector to build your housing, you're going to be building market rate.
I mean, just
a
quick comment on that. You know, the city is trying really hard to increase their investment in affordable housing, but you know, we in the past few decades, the funding for affordable housing has definitely decreased from the federal level, state level, and it is not financially feasible to build 100% affordable housing on a large site. So using the subsidy that comes with market rate has been definitely a strategy to make the increase the number of units rather than percentages of affordable housing on every single. So our hope is to get more affordable housing built and take more leverage from funding sources that we already have.
Mari, did you have another comment?
Yes, actually, I did. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering, we're talking about funding here. Some of the groups I've been talking to have been discussing more options for rent to own and allowing more people to join the housing market that way. And is there any consideration for putting together packages like that for people who are paying rent anyway, to give them some options to turn that into some kind of equity for themselves? And also, there's been a lot of talk about reusing buildings. Is there any consideration in the housing element for reuse of commercial properties such as empty office buildings or any of the large retail or any of the empty commercial properties? It's actually cheaper to reuse the property than to start from scratch. So has there been any discussion of adding that into the housing element? Reuse, essentially, repurposing, it's called.
I'll take that. Yeah, definitely on the second piece, I think when the draft talks about underutilized land due to, you know, kind of big box retail that went out of business and things like that. So that's definitely part of the consideration. The rent to own, I think, is definitely a great idea. I don't think it's made it to the first draft, but would love kind of any specific policies and recommendations you have, and we can definitely consider it, including it.
There's also, there seems to be some effort going forward to establish a city public bank that would maybe allow some stuff like that to be a little easier to finance. And there's also, of course, a lot of discussion about the city buying the grid in the city, which could also make that kind of situation, particularly with regard to the solar rooftop panels, a lot more friendly and a lot more viable. So those are some other options. If nobody's really considered any of that, let me know and I will work with somebody on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
There was a question in the chat about SB 9 and SB 10 and how are those bills being coordinated? Of course, those are bills that came out of legislators from San Francisco, and I'm presuming all of the legislators in San Francisco are supporting them. How do they tie in with the housing element? Or do they?
I guess as long as the bill is not passed yet, there's no way for us to kind of know how they would tie in. So once it's passed, and if it's passed, then definitely it will be reflected.
Right, and the city, as I understand it, is supporting both of those bills. Is that correct?
No,
No?
I don't think so. They weren't.
Actually, I don't know the answer to that question.
I will get back to you on
Okay.
it, Stuart.
Let's see, Linda, do you have another question?
I have about 3 if I can, now that others have had a
Okay,
chance.
We're running short on time, but I think there's not too many other people that have questions to ask. So if you want to go ahead, go
All
ahead.
right, so one is, you need to consider communicating with the rest of the government that we can't build our way out of, a supply and demand situation. They made this horrible mistake of trying to attract every high-paid techie in the nation here. Whereas this city used to be a working class town and a bohemian town. I'm a native, 3 generations. Any working class person could eventually, if they save, buy a home, most likely. Rents were cheap and, rental units were abundant. And in the 70s, I thought, that maybe Bruce Brugman was a little bit, what would you say, kind of intense about Manhattanization, but he was right. That's exactly what happened. The city insisted on bringing in all these businesses that brought in all these really high-paid people, and then they drove everybody else out or made it impossible for, people like my family members to buy homes. They had to move to the suburbs, et cetera. So that's one thing, Two,
So it's essentially what I think what you're saying there is that the focus of the planning department seems to be on supply, but maybe they need to be looking also at demand and asking, do we want to continue having an increased demand by high income folks that drive everybody else out of the city? Does that seem to capture what you're saying?
Excuse me.
And I don't know, does the housing element speak at all to that other side of the equation?
Some planning, you're doing all this, but at the same time, somebody needs to communicate with the executive branch and others that this is just, a hopeless situation if they continue that kind of policy on jobs. Your printed material talk about the jobs, and so many more jobs and not so many more housing units. Well, another way to deal with that is not to try to attract all those high income jobs. We can't deal with it in this small city without much land, et cetera. Second thing that I wanted to bring up was like in the Nob Hill area, for example, there are these crazy policies as far as I can see when I discover that they insist that developers have to put so many 2 and 3 bedroom units in the apartments. It's like ill thought out stuff, because that's not the kind of neighborhood this ever was. This was always like a lot of 1 bedroom apartments and studios and a few 2 bedrooms and so on. So the only thing that they're doing there is actually creating housing for richer people, because families with children are not going to live in those elevator buildings, things like that. They don't have a perspective necessarily on the places. And right now we've had like recently 3 projects that are just horrible for the neighborhood, horrible for the people who are going to live in them in some cases, but they're housing. And by God, we've got to approve them because they're offering housing. So that concludes my report.
I don't know if, do either of you have something to comment on that?
I guess I don't know if there was a specific question there.
Well, I think what she was talking about is essentially not matching up the type of housing being built to the people that need the housing and what people want in terms of the type of housing. And does the housing element at all address trying to match housing about the type of housing being built to the demand for different types of housing?
I mean, I guess what the housing element is trying to do is definitely to match the demand and supply. So with the increase in demand, but I guess your earlier question of does the city want to change the patterns of job growth? I definitely think that's a separate conversation, but the conversation that has been had before. And as part of San Francisco or the region, we can decide to not attract jobs and that kind of wealth to our region, because even if San Francisco doesn't have jobs, neighboring cities, when they have those jobs, employees could find San Francisco an attractive place to live in, and still that demand gets added to the city. So I guess the housing element by itself is addressing that demand.
The demand for housing and not necessarily where it's coming from.
It's divided by income level. So the 82,000 units that's allocated to us is divided by different income levels. 35,000 of it approximately is for housing that serves above moderate, and the rest of it is for housing that serves extremely low to moderate income households.
As I recall, there was, I remember sitting in on a Board of Supervisors session that they had with the planning department talking about the progress towards meeting the regional housing needs allocations. And as I recall, the striking thing about that was that almost all of the different economic categories were below what was set, except for market rate, which was well above the goal that the RENA goal. And can housing element do anything about that?
Sure, the housing element is, I guess, elevating that gap and talking about that gap. And as a city, we're trying to piece together new and more funding sources. We just passed a housing bond. We passed a few different taxes to help fund housing. So through the housing element process, by just identifying and measuring and calculating that gap, it helps the city plan for additional funding that's needed to build those units.
Okay, we are running a bit over time, but we did start a little late. I'm going to ask Bernie if he has one more question, and then we'll see whether we want to wrap up or whether we want to go on.
Yeah, I thank you for some very intelligent discussion. The state housing element effectively no longer exists. It's been eviscerated. It does include an economic element. And I think wisely, we also have to look at what creates income and jobs and so-called for those who need affordability, and not just housing per se, but the whole range. What we had for several decades was a housing element that looked at transportation, the environment, the economics, all of that. It no longer exists. And the city has not replaced it ever. It has not been effective. As to who gets the so-called market rate housing. You put $500,000 in effect from sovereign wealth money in China and Japan, and you get a green card. That's who's buying transitory housing. We're a hotel for rich people. You cannot just blame in effect high tech. It's the fact is we don't have a private enterprise that effectively makes economic in effect adjustments. You cannot bid against scarcity, as Stuart advised. You create inflation, and that's what we've got. You don't have a law. You didn't obey the law when it existed. And so I think, Stuart, it's in the province of the legal people. As you know, we went to Fort War on that, on Park Merced. And the judges said, what do you want to do, preserve the cities in alabaster? That was an illegal opinion and remark, as you remember.
They don't know what that means.
Mary?
Yes, I heard mentioned a couple of times the idea of limiting zoning changes, and I was a little bit confused about what that meant. Are we limiting zoning changes in some parts of the city and not others? And what does limiting zoning changes mean? Because it seems like that's mainly what we're doing, is changing the zoning. So what does that mean, that the position is to limit zoning changes?
Yeah, I want to clarify that. Thanks for asking. The reference to limiting zoning changes was specifically for those neighborhoods that have been experiencing the highest number in housing production over the last 2 or 3 decades, and the highest rate of zoning changes due to our eastern neighborhoods planning efforts. So recognizing that the rate of change has been so significant, and that the rate of displacement and gentrification is also very high, as shown in our displacement map, in those areas, that we wanted to rein in zoning changes, to limit them to zoning changes that have been found to specifically benefit American Indian, Black, or other communities of color, so that when we are making zoning changes in those areas, they are very precise and with very targeted purpose to benefit marginalized communities. So there are, although there are no zoning changes proposed in the housing element, we do foresee, as a result of the policies we're putting in place, that there would be zoning changes implementing policy after adoption that would look at zoning changes primarily in those high opportunity areas, which are largely on the western side of the city. And that is where we in the EIR would be studying potential height increases, particularly around transit, high quality transit corridors and transit nodes, and also looking at removing density controls to allow us to move away from single family housing development in those areas.
Well, that's
Would-
Geography start to make more sense now.
yes, that's SB 9 and SB 10. So I'm particularly concerned about what's been happening in the eastern side. It looks as if you're going to basically shift the focus to the side of the city that hasn't been developed yet and start to leave other people alone. I don't know. We're having problems with height limits. So would any of these zoning changes affect the height limits at all? Or would this just be, is it a density factor, or is it a combination of both? When we're talking zoning changes. Well, we have PDRs in our neighborhood, and there's a big issue about trying to protect the PDRs that has been ignored, even though we passed Proposition X. So we're just wondering, at what point do we start enforcing some of those decisions that the voters made, such as keeping the PDRs. Also, I guess this also falls into play about the zoning as far as the office space is concerned, because the whole point was to sort of not continue to build more offices. And we're seeing them still coming into our neighborhood. And we're seeing, I'm in the Mission, and we're seeing retail, which we don't seem to need anymore, and the amount that it's being suggested. So at some point, when does this kind of realization of these changes come about? This would be under zoning, right? Or is it, I guess it's under use. Zoning is more height and all that. So maybe I'm thinking use. That makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure which neighborhood you live in and you're talking about specifically.
The
so
Mission.
The Mission, right?
Yeah.
So the Mission kind of falls into our priority geographies, areas of the city that we want to limit zoning changes to the needs of American Indian, Black, and other communities of color. So, you know, if there were to be zoning changes about PDRs, there would be kind of processes to directly consult with those communities to make sure those changes would benefit them. Same thing with changes to allow use. For areas of the city that are identified by state as high opportunity areas, the draft currently considers increasing height along with density, along the transit corridors, but only increasing density in the low density zone. So no height change, for example, in your RHs and NCs, but some changes, height changes along your main, the NCs sometimes fall along the transit corridors. So height changes along the transit corridors are being considered, and throughout the kind of broader low density zones in the high opportunity areas, the consideration right now is just to remove density.
So I'm just curious in terms of the, you know, the general plan is supposed to be an integrated document, and you've got the housing element, and that's what you're working on now. But then there's the land use and transportation element, which certainly ties in a lot. I mean, I think probably half the comments and questions have been coming in have been about things that really are in the land use and transportation element. How do you integrate those?
I can address that, Kimmy, if you want. So the department is actively updating the transportation element as well. We're also updating the community safety element, and we're also building out an environmental justice framework that will start to load in policy amendments to the entire general plan. I do want to acknowledge that our general plan has many elements that are very out of date and that have not been updated in many years and critically needed. So we are working very closely with specifically the transportation team, but all the general plan update teams right now. We all review each other's drafts and work together to make sure that we're bolstering each other's policy goals. So to the degree that we are working together on those 4 projects right now on integration, and over time, it is the hope that the entire general plan is updated and in a much healthier state.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think we probably run well over our limit here. So I don't know, is it time to call it quits for the night?